Hello. So my name is Mike Mollick. I'm the lead developer and co-founder of a company called NeverBounce. We're a email verification and deliverability company. But I'm not here to talk about email deliverability or what email verification is. I'm actually here to talk to you about a problem that we actually encountered in starting NeverBounce. That's credit card fraud. So as consumers, a lot of us are already familiar with credit card fraud, identity theft. It's a very common thing. So common that 1 in 3 Americans reported credit card fraud in 2016 alone. We've all heard the stories of, skimmers on ATM machines, gas pumps. It's out there and it's everywhere. So as a merchant running an online business that takes credit cards, this also affects us. So in 2017, there was over $24.25 billion in losses due to credit card fraud. And this is shared not with the consumer, but it's shared between the banks and the merchants. So of this $24.26 billion in losses, about 30% or $7.25 billion is actually incurred from the merchant themselves. Which if you're, a startup bootstrapping or trying to sell, PDFs or sticker packs or t-shirts online, this can be a big issue. As consumers, of course, it's not the end of the world. Consumers have a secret weapon. They're called chargebacks. So what is a chargeback? Chargebacks are consumer protection against unauthorized charges and unfulfilled services. What they do is they give the consumer zero liability. That allows them to get their money back. It acts as a refund. They don't have to talk to the merchant to do this. They can just call their bank and say, hey, I didn't make this charge. And they're going to get their money back 9 times out of 10. And of course, this is a path of least resistance for consumers. They don't have to go out and find whoever, the charge descriptor on their credit card statement. They don't have to look up who that is, talk to their support, and hope that they believe them when they say they didn't make this charge. And of course, it does lead to some issues with what's known as friendly fraud, which is essentially just abuse of this mechanism. It's not super common, but it does happen. And chargebacks as a merchant, so we have to remember chargebacks are consumer protection. They aren't there for us as a merchant. The merchant assumes all liability when a chargeback happens. And what it is a forced refund. You don't have control over this. So when a chargeback comes in, say for a $100 transaction, that $100 is immediately removed from your account. On top of that, there's also a fee assessed. So in the instance of Stripe, which is a pretty popular payment processing platform, they charge $15 every time you get a chargeback. So that $100 transaction is now $115 coming out of your account. And this also means we have to reply to this chargeback. We are actually expected to prove to the bank that the charge is legitimate. So because the bank is believing their customer, which is the consumer or the cardholder, as a merchant, it's actually placed on us to prove whether or not a charge is actually legitimate. So that means collecting things like IP addresses, activity logs, any communication you've had with the customer. So, maybe emails, chat logs, anything that you have to send over to this bank in the hopes that they'll believe you and they'll see it in your activity logs and your evidence that the charge is in fact valid. And oftentimes this isn't successful because remember, we're expecting the consumer's bank to believe us that this is valid rather than believe the consumer, which of course they're not going to. We're not the bank's customer. The cardholder and consumer is the customer. So if that wasn't bad enough, this also impacts our reputation with our payment processor. So Stripe, Braintree, AuthorizeNet, Adyen, all these payment processors that allow us to collect credit card information and, actually make money doing what we are doing. They all have what's called a chargeback rate threshold, which essentially means in a given time frame, most of the time it's 30 days, if you have 100 transactions in that 30-day window, you get one chargeback out of those 100 transactions. You now have a 1% chargeback rate. And in the case of a lot of these, the more popular Stripe and Braintrees, they actually have a 1% chargeback threshold. So in this scenario, if you have 100 transactions and just one of those becomes a chargeback, you're now at their threshold. If you get one more chargeback after that, they're going to send you a warning letter. And they're going to expect you to take action to actually reduce how many chargebacks you receive. So, and if you don't do anything about it, they will eventually kick you off their platform. In the case of NeverBounce, we had this happen to us. We actually, credit card fraud just got out of hand for a little bit, and we ended up getting too many chargebacks, and Stripe actually told us to go away. And we had 2 weeks to migrate to a new payment processor, and 2 weeks is not enough time to make that big of a change. It can be done, but it is not fun. So once a chargeback happens, there is no going back. So the only thing you can do is submit evidence to hope that it's reversed. You can't refund a chargeback and expect it to go away. You're still going to pay that fee, and you're still going to be deemed by that the chargeback rate. It's a common misconception that you can refund it, and then you avoid the chargeback penalty, the fees, but that just doesn't work. So now that we know what chargebacks look like, now that we know what a chargeback is, let's talk about what credit card fraud looks like from the merchant's perspective. So as merchants, we have a ton of actionable data that we can use to make a pretty informed decision on whether or not a charge is valid or not. We're going to have names, email addresses, we're going to have the billing details, address, cardholder name, and then of course we're going to have activity data. We're going to have IP addresses, and we're going to know what this user has done on our site. So all of this can be used to make a very informed decision on whether or not this is a suspicious user. So let's go through a couple example transactions. So in this case, we have a guy named Bill, and he made a $100 transaction. And we can see the cardholder name matches his name, and we can see his billing address is from Montreal. It's only until we get to the IP address and geodecode it that we actually notice that there's an issue with this transaction. And we can see that the issue here is that Bill made his $100 purchase from Morocco with his credit card from Montreal. And this isn't always a problem. There are a lot of satellite offices, remote workers. It's pretty common to see billing addresses and physical device locations mismatch. But generally when that happens, it's going to be with a small to medium sized or some sort of B2B business-to-business email address. So the fact that this is billy@gmail.com tells us this isn't, this isn't like a business transaction. So in this case, what we would do is we would actually probably refund this transaction because we know with a pretty good certainty that this will result in a chargeback later down the road. So here's another example. In this case, we have Will, and he also made a $100 transaction. This time, his billing address is from Alexandria, Virginia. And then when we take a look at the IP address, we see the device location is from Ashburn, Virginia. Which it's very reasonable to assume that Will might commute from Ashburn to Alexandria. It's well within the realm of possibility that that's his daily commute, or maybe he's working from home. It's only until you look at the type of network that this is actually occurring from and the ISP. So as we can see here, it's a hosting network and it's from Amazon.com. If any of you are familiar with AWS, you know what's in Ashburn. That's their US East 1 data center, which is like kind of their default data center. So it's pretty safe to assume that in this case, this transaction is actually coming from that data center, meaning someone is making this transaction using some sort of VPN that they set up on an EC2 instance or some sort of compute instance within the Amazon data center. And this is a pretty typical scenario. And again, we have to really take into consideration what kind of user we're dealing with. In this case, again, it's a Gmail address. It's not a business customer. So we know with a pretty good certainty that this is likely going to be another case of a chargeback in the future. So we would go ahead and refund this and block the account so that they can't make further purchases. So let's take a look at some user activity. So this is another metric that we like to use to identify suspicious users. So in this case, we can see that this user, they view the pricing page, spend a few minutes looking at the pricing options before taking a look at some of the help doc articles, eventually registering an account, and eventually actually making a transaction. And you can see this occurs over several minutes. This is pretty natural for a new user coming to our service. They're not familiar with our site, they're not familiar with our pricing, so they're gonna take a look at all this. Moving forward, we can see another example here where a user is coming directly to our site and they already know where everything is. So they're not wasting any time looking at pricing. They're not looking for where the registration page is. This user obviously already knows where everything is. In the span of a minute, they've already made a purchase from not having an account. And this is a very unnatural occurrence. In this case, we know that this user is likely going to be a fraudulent user who's trying to abuse a system or just trying to commit credit card fraud. So this can happen though, where we do have direct traffic and the user knows exactly where they're going. Oftentimes, if you have an existing user that has to create a second account for a client or a team member, they're not going to waste any time looking at pricing pages. But you're going to notice that through, again, their email is going to tell them or tell you that they're a business user. They're not just an off the street, Gmail or Yahoo account. So moving forward, we can also take a look at account activity or account information. In this case, we can see that, Bill signed up with billy@gmail.com. On his credit card, he's using the name Billy Hanover. That all makes sense. So what we do look out for, though, is when things don't quite add up here. When you see someone signing up with the name Bill, and then their email is Susan Scott at Gmail, but the card name is also Bill, that tells us that something's wrong here, and that's something that we need to keep an eye out for. This account, when they do make a transaction, it's likely going to be with a fraudulent credit card. This typically doesn't happen naturally. And of course, business users, you'll see, the cardholder name probably won't match, but the name on the account and the name on the email typically will. So let's take a look at a few techniques that are used or a few patterns that are used. So credit card testing is a term used for identifying credit cards that are purchased on the black market that actually work. So oftentimes what will happen are these fraudsters will go out to the dark net and black market to actually purchase a bundle of credit cards that they don't know if they work or not, because they're just getting kind of like a grab bag of credit card information. And they're going to go to your site and they're going to just make low dollar amount purchases in the hopes that one of those succeed. Once one does succeed, now they know that that credit card can be used for more transactions. They can either use it on your site for a bigger transaction, or they can just go to another website and use it there where they don't already have this history of credit card testing. It's pretty common to see multiple different credit cards being used, and one passes and then they just stop and you don't see them again. And that's because they're just using your application to identify the card that works, and then they're going to someone else's application to actually make a larger purchase. So here's another example of credit card testing. This one's a little different. In this case, we actually only have one credit card being used. But what they're doing is they're starting with the highest dollar amount that they can charge using whatever prepackaged tiers that you have on your application. So in this case, they're starting off with the $1,000 package, then they're going down to $500, $250, and they're just trying to find a tier that will work. At which point, now they have exactly what they're looking for. They're just trying to get the most bang for their time, or the most amount of money in the least amount of time. So it's important to also take into consideration application and industry specific indicators for fraud and suspicious activity. And you really do have to kind of come at it with a black hat and just really think about how your application can be used maliciously and who would actually want to use your application maliciously. In the case of NoBounce, we deal with email deliverability. So we're great for marketers, we're great for salesmen, and unfortunately we're great for spammers. If you know anything about spamming, you know it's illegal in most countries. So when spammers try to use our service, they're not using the real name, they're not using the real credit card. They're going to come in with stolen identities to just try to get in and out without us noticing. So what we have to do is we have to identify where these spammers are going to be coming from. And most spammers are going to come from countries where spamming isn't as harshly punished. In the US, it's upwards of $10,000 per spam email sent that you can be fined. So they're going to come from a lot of countries in North Africa, Southeast Asia, where spam laws aren't as harsh. So those are all higher risk when we see those countries make a transaction, because we know there's a higher chance that those are going to be fraudulent users. So now we've gone through a couple examples of what credit card fraud looks like from merchants' perspective. And there could easily be a whole afternoon just talking about like the kind of patterns that we've come across. This certainly isn't exhaustive. But let's talk about some practical steps on what we can do to combat fraud. So the basics are just already available to you. Credit card security codes, those 3 to 4 digit codes on your credit card. A lot of websites, they don't actually verify those. A lot of banks don't even verify those. That's actually an option that we have to enable within our payment processors. So Stripe, Braintree, they all have like little check boxes or buttons that you click to actually enable this check. Same with address verification. So that means your mailing address and your zip code. Again, a lot of services just don't bother verifying this at all. And this actually does stop a lot of the just kind of most basic level of fraud. It's not going to stop all of it. Of course, there's a lot more advanced fraudsters that are going to get past that, no problem. But this will stop just kind of the kind of top level of it. And again, both of these credit card security codes and address verification, those are both just enabled within your payment processor. So 3D Secure, that it's not a common mechanism used here in North America, but it is common in Europe. And this is another mechanism that the Visa, MasterCard, Discover, they've all adopted to help mitigate credit card fraud in Europe. And again, this is something that that's already available to you if you're using payment processor like Stripe, Braintree. They all support it. However, it does require some development on your front end, unless of course you're using like an out-of-the-box Stripe checkout, or I think Braintree has a variant of that as well. But these are all kind of the freebies. You don't cost anything to implement other than maybe an hour or two at most. So beyond just these basic anti-fraud mechanisms, there's also anti-fraud platforms. So these allow us to define suspicious activity. So those patterns that I was talking about before, where we're seeing, if we have high-risk countries that are making transactions, we can actually define rules that say, if this country makes a $1,000 purchase, flag it for review, or just decline it. We can actually do that with an anti-fraud platform. In addition to that, anti-fraud platforms, they typically leverage data from other merchants on their network. So if we're using Stripe, we're also leveraging the data from whoever else uses Stripe. So if they see an IP address make a fraudulent charge, that IP address is going to be blocked from our account as well. If they try to make a purchase on our system with that same IP address, Stripe is going to take care of that for us. And a lot of these platforms are either AI or machine learning assisted, meaning that they'll constantly look at your transactions as they come in, and they'll try to evaluate new rules that they can create to help block these fraudulent transactions. And there's actually, most payment processors will either have their own version of this, or they will partner with a third party. In the case of Stripe, they built their own called Radar. In the case of Braintree, they partner with a company called Count. And of course, there's always going to be manual review. You'll never get away from that. So even with these anti-fraud platforms, sometimes you're still going to have to review transactions manually. So it's important to train yourself to identify it and train your staff to identify it. You'll never get away from it, no matter how hard you try. So to recap, as merchants, chargebacks are terrible. They're great for consumers, but if you're running an online business that takes credit card payments, they can just kill you. You need to identify patterns that exist within your own transaction history, so that you can hopefully create rules and systems to actually block these transactions from ever occurring. Once chargeback happens, there's no going back. And you're always going to have to continuously iterate on this. It's never going to go away, and it's never going to be completely solved. The smarter as your anti-fraud technique or anti-fraud efforts increase, so are the actual fraudsters. They're going to get smarter, they're going to try harder, and they're going to be harder to spot. That's why a lot of those anti-fraud platforms are moving towards AI and machine learning to actually help with that. And I can be contacted at any of these. And if you have any questions, I'll be around. Thank you for letting me talk to you about credit card fraud.